reality is we need to look at the longer term for this reseed. We need to set up a field that is going to perform for 10 years, possibly even longer. So if we delay sowing it a week now, it's not really going to cost us anything in the long run, but it'll probably benefit us in terms of setting up the field better.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc sheep podcast. Each episode will bring less insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Now, in this joint episode, I'm joined by my colleague Catherine Egan, host of The Beef Edge, as we catch up with Dr Mary McEvoy, Technical Development Manager with Germinal, to discuss all things reseeding. Mary discussed our top tips from field preparation to seed mixes both for grazing and silage, as well as clover inclusion. We also discussed post-sowing management and the impact that can have on a successful reseed. We hear now from Catherine and Mary.
We're seeing a lot of interest in reseeding this year, and I suppose over the last couple of years, as you've rightly said, the spring has been quite challenging in terms of getting the opportunity to reseed. But, the weather has been good up until maybe this week, and, it's kind of put reseeding front of mind for a lot of people. Look, when we're thinking about reseeding, I suppose the first thing we really need to consider is the soil fertility and have a good handle on soil fertility across the farm, because in order to get the most out of a reseed, it's critically important that your soil pH, P's and K's are optimised. Otherwise, what will happen is, you go to the cost and effort of reseeding, and if your pHs are low or your P's and K's are low, within 2 to 3 years, you're going to be back to square one. You'll have weed grasses starting to come into the sward, and your sown perennial ryegrass species and your clovers as well, which do require that optimised pH and P and K in particular to allow for fixation of nitrogen. They won't perform as they should. So in order to get the most out of reseeding, it is critically important that we do, have a plan in place, pick those fields which have good soil fertility and also those fields which are underperforming. And I suppose on that front, it's really useful, just to keep records of, how many grazings maybe you're getting off a field, or how many cuts of silage or trailer loads of silage are coming out of a field, just to have a bit of a handle in terms of, are fields starting to deteriorate? Are you not getting into a particular field as frequently as other fields? Maybe it's a clear sign that, it's kind of past its best and, a one to target for reseeding.
Mary, typically on dry stock farms, we normally think about reseeding in the autumn. What's the benefits of going in now at this stage of the season? Yeah,
so look, Kieran, I suppose going in now, I suppose there's a lot of benefits from the plant's perspective in terms of getting the plant up and going. From now on, temperatures should start to be on the rise, which will aid faster germination. And if we can germinate our sown species or grasses and clovers quicker, they're going to be better able to outcompete weeds. On top of that, I suppose you've really good quality grass coming into the system then, in July, August, when, it's a good time for maybe finishing lambs and the likes, or, for a beef system as well, obviously. On top of that, you'll get a couple of grazings off the sward across the summer when conditions should be pretty favourable, I suppose, which will help tiller out and ticken up the sward. And you also have a much greater window of opportunity for getting out with your post-emergent spray with a spring reseed compared to the autumn reseed. The biggest challenge we see with the autumn reseed is, the weather breaks. You've sprayed off the field, the weather breaks and goes against you. You don't get the seed into the ground as quick as you'd like. So you're on the back foot then, and, it could be late September before the seed is sown. And then 6 weeks later, maybe, weather isn't suitable to go out and spray, so you don't get that post-emergent spray done. And coming to following spring, those weeds have developed, strong roots and are much, much harder to kill. So a lot to be said in terms of, your frequent grazings that you can get with your spring reseed, and also getting out with your post-emergent spray just to set up the sward and get it off on the best foot possible.
Most definitely, Mary. When it comes to carrying out the reseeding process, what are the main options available to farmers?
Yeah, so look, I suppose, the plough, which we're probably seeing a move away from in recent years, Catherine, unless you really, need to level a field, there's less ploughing happening across the board, I would say. After that, you're looking at like the likes of a disc and one pass, or, direct drilling. And I suppose, the research would show that, when conditions are right and everything is done right, there's very little difference between the different methods in terms of the subsequent sward that gets established. What we would see as a company, I suppose, is especially as we get into that autumn period, so into kind of September sowings, where we're direct drilling seed, often they can be the most challenging, and that's often where we see the most complaints, because we tend to see greater proportion of slug attacks, and because the seed has been buried into the ground, unless the lime is absolutely optimized and lime has went out on the field, it can be much more challenging in terms of a direct drill scenario to get seed established in the autumn. But in the spring, generally, not much of a difference between them once everything is set up correctly to give the seed every chance, I suppose.
I suppose that's the key point, Mary. Really, what are the key steps involved in advance in relation to preparing the seedbed?
Yeah, so look, I mean, at this stage, soil having a soil test done over the early or late winter period, I suppose. If you have a soil test, that's absolutely critical, because that kind of gives you, a starting point. You know where you stand with the field. You know what the pH is. You know how much lime it's going to require, and it kind of sets you up on the right foot, I suppose. Obviously, spraying off is critical. Follow the label guidelines with your glyphosate spray. And I suppose what I would say is allow the spray adequate time to work, because, often people are in such a rush to do a reseed and get it turned around, and have the seed in the ground within 10 days or 2 weeks. But, the reality is we need to look at the longer term for this reseed. We need to set up a field that is going to perform for, 10 years, possibly even longer. So if we delay sowing it a week, now it's not really going to cost us anything in the long run, but it probably benefit us in terms of setting up the field better. So after you apply the spray, we need to leave it long enough for that spray to work. And especially where we're doing the more mintal options, obviously with ploughing, you can go in that little bit quicker. But if we're discing or power harrowing, we need to allow that spray time to work, because where we go in too quickly and work the seed bed, after 12 or 14 days, that's where we tend to see an awful lot of sods in the seed bed, and a very, what we would say, cloddy seed bed, which can then get pulled apart by crows as they go after earthworms and likes. So if we can leave it closer to that 3 weeks period from spraying to going in and working the seed bed, for that disc or mintal options, it just gives a much better seed bed. So, you're starting off on the right foot. You get much better placement of the seed in that seed bed. You'll have a firmer and a finer seed bed. And essentially, everything is kind of going to work in your favour at that point then as well. So I would just say, try avoid going too quickly. It's not a race. Getting it right from the start is a worthwhile investment in the long run.
Mary, when we get to the stage of where we're ready to sow it, we're looking at the seed mix. In terms of varieties, what should be in that mix? A couple of key things to look out for. Maybe if we start from a grazing point of view first, because a lot of reseeds will be going back into the grazing rotation. What are a couple of key things we need to look for in that seed mix?
Yeah, so look, first and foremost, I suppose, Ciarán, we need to be looking at varieties that are on the recommended list and Pasture Profit Index. And, that's an absolute minimum essential requirement, I suppose I would say. On top of that, obviously, there's a range within that Pasture Profit Index for people who are familiar with it. It's an economic ranking index for grass varieties, and identifies, the spring, summer and autumn dry matter yield performance of individual varieties, the quality, the silage performance, the persistency and the quality of those varieties as well. So I suppose, having a look at that Pasture Profit Index list and making sure, I suppose, you're picking kind of, the better performing varieties are off that, and the mixture you're selecting is well balanced across those key traits, because you mightn't have 5 or you mightn't have 4 varieties within a mixture which are all excellent in terms of their spring growth. You might have 3 of the 4 might be good in spring growth, and different varieties will bring different benefits to the mixture. But I suppose it's about looking at, and matching it to your system as well, I suppose. So if it's a grazing system or silage system, you're going to be looking at the slightly different traits. But, generally speaking, I suppose reasonable spring growth is desirable, for a sheep system then, obviously. Good performance across the summer and the autumn period. High quality, which is going to bring beneficial effects in terms of animal performance. And, if it's a silage field, then we're also going to focus more on that silage subindices, so identifying varieties which will deliver more for a 2-cut silage system in particular. So I suppose it's just, get your hands on that Pasture Profit Index or the recommended list. It's available online. Just Google Teagasc Pasture Profit Index and it'll come up. And, that's kind of the varieties that are tested here in Ireland, proven in the Department of Agriculture trials. And, they're the ones which are working well for Irish scenarios.
I think that's useful. And you did make a bit of differentiation there between grazing paddocks, silage ground. Oftentimes we'll talk a little bit about maybe the Tetroploid and diploid mix in it. Mary, is that, and from that point of view, we should look at? I'm thinking here too, question I'm sure you often get is, if you're on heavier ground, does that need to change slightly?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I suppose heavier ground, traditionally we would use more diploids. The diploids basically are denser grasses, and they're more prostrate in their growth habits, so they kind of, act more like a carpet underneath the foot of the animal, so to speak. So, if you remember the D for diploids, that's bringing your density to the sward. Tetroploids, on the other hand, look, it's becoming more and more recognised the benefits of tetroploids from a quality perspective, from a palatability perspective as well. The tetroploids probably are that bit easier to graze from an animal's perspective. They tend to be higher quality. They're more upright in their growth habit, but they're also a little bit more open. So, for heavier ground, I suppose, we tend to still use a little bit more diploid in those, but I think that tetroploid proportion is always really important. On really good quality, or on really good, or relatively free draining soils, you're probably going to be up around 50% tetroploid in the mixture. But on heavier soils, we're going to probably be closer down to that 30% tetroploid proportion, because that'll just give the best balance in terms of performance, palatability and quality from the sward. So, and every farm probably has a range of soil types on here on as well. So what's right for one field on a farm mightn't necessarily be the right mixture for another field on the farm. So it is important just to consider the type of ground you're going into and what mixture is going to suit that ground best. And I know we mentioned silage there a minute ago, and I suppose the only other thing I would say is to consider in terms of your silage ground. Is it a one cut silage, or are you to plan on taking 2 or 3 cuts off it? Because again, that's going to influence the type of mixture that we go for. So for someone maybe not taking the first cut of silage until the early days of June, we're probably going to focus more on late heading varieties in that mixture, because they'll hold their quality better. But if someone's planning to take their first cut of silage around the 20th or 25th of May, you're going to focus more on intermediates, because they'll deliver more yield at that time over the late heading varieties. So again, it's just matching your individual requirements to the mixture that you're going to select.
Once the varieties are selected, Mary, what are the recommended seeding rates?
Yeah, so I suppose, Catherine, I suppose most of the co-ops and merchants out there probably are trying to formulate, optimum mixtures to meet local conditions, I suppose. So, I suppose when we're talking about this, it's worth also noting that, your local merchant or co-op probably has, a very a well-designed mix to suit local requirements. And they'll all be focused on the pasture profit index in terms of how they design their mixes as well. In terms of the sowing rate, look, this is, I suppose, a little bugbear of mine. Most of your grass seed mixes out there have about 12 kilos in a pack. The recommended sowing rate would be 14 kilos to the acre. So, if you're doing 5 acres, you're probably going to have to get 6 bags. And, I suppose I'm trying to push to get 14 kilos in a bag. I think it make it simpler for everyone. But I suppose until the industry as a whole moves that direction, it might be a slow burn from my part. But yeah, 14 kilos to the acre is the desired sowing rate.
And then in relation to white clover inclusion rates in that mix, what would you advise?
Yeah, so look, I suppose, we're all well tuned into the benefits of white clover in terms of what it can deliver from an animal performance perspective, but also as well its ability to fix nitrogen. So we are seeing an increased interest in white clover in recent years. And, definitely in sheep systems, there's a high value in terms of having about 2 kilos of white clover into your mixture, and maybe a mixture of both small and medium leaf white clovers in that scenario works well. The medium leaf clovers will yield a little bit more, but the small leaf clovers will be that little bit more persistent under that kind of intensive sheep grazing scenario. So a mixture of a kilo of both, one small, one medium leaf white clover. So 2 kilos of white clover in a 14 kilo bag is kind of your ideal rate of white clover.
Mary, sometimes we see on clover some will be pelleted. What's the difference there?
Yeah, so I suppose pelleted clover probably is kind of gone out of the system now at this stage, Kieran. So pelleted clover is kind of a coated clover. It was coated with a little bit of lime, and generally a bit of fertilizer was included as well, just to kind of give the clover, which is a very small seed, the chance to get up and going. But most of the mixtures that you will see out there now are naked, what we call naked clover, so they're not coated. So the big thing with clover is not to bury it too deep, and I suppose to have a firm seed bed, because where we have a really fluffy seed bed, that's where we can end up clover going down too deep. But where we have a firm seed bed, because of the size of the clover seed, it's very, very small compared to the size of grass seed. And when it gets rolled, it can often be pushed down too far. But having a good firm seed bed will help avoid that issue.
Maybe we also start to see a little bit of red clover coming in the mixes, maybe some more focus on silage ground. What kind of inclusion rates are you looking at if you are considering a bit of red clover in that mix?
Yeah, so look, the Department of Agriculture have their red clover silage scheme measure there again this year. They also have the multi-scheme measure, which we should mention as well. But that measure requires farmers to include 4 kilos of red clover in a 12 kilo pack. Okay, the white clover and the perennial ryegrasses within that mixture have to be on the Irish recommended list. Okay, and 4 kilos of red clover in a silage scenario does work really well. You know, it's allowing us produce high protein silage with much lower levels of nitrogen, and even in a lot of scenarios farmers aren't using any nitrogen. Some would be using about 50 kilos of nitrogen to the hectare on that 4 kilos of red clover, going out with nitrogen in the spring and then no nitrogen required thereafter. Slurry or P and K are meeting the requirements of that silage sward thereafter. We're seeing a little more interest as well in terms of red clover in grazing mixtures. And probably a kilo of red clover in a grazing mixture is where a lot of the interest is, or maybe up to 2 kilos of red and 2 kilos of white, an absolute maximum. Okay, we do need to bear in mind that where we're at that level of red clover, there can be concerns for sheep around 6 weeks either side of tupping, and we would advise sheep don't graze red clover 6 weeks either side of tupping because it can affect their fertility. But there is growing interest, and I suppose recent work from Teagasc and Athenry have shown that where lambs are grazing red clover, we're also seeing reduced methane emissions from those lambs. So from an environmental perspective, a little bit more work probably needs to be done in this area, but from an environmental perspective and from a reducing agricultural emissions perspective, there might be more value into the future in using red clover in grazing mixes.
Moving then, Mary, to post-reseeding, what do you see as the key management tasks?
Yeah, so I suppose, your post-emergent spray is something that we really need to focus on in that regard, Catherine. And the timing of that spray is absolutely crucial because, the biggest issue we see is, the spray not going out on time, and it not being as effective then on the weeds you're trying to kill. And this is especially important, I suppose, where we have clover included in the mixture. So essentially there's really only two products available there this year for clover. For white clover, the only product that can be used, or the only product that's licensed to be used, is a product called ProClova. Really important with this product to ensure when you're using it that 3 days either side of spraying that soil temperatures are 8 degrees. Okay, if we're below that, the product isn't near as effective. So we need to pay more attention, I think, to reading labels before we apply products, because there's no point in applying a spray if we're not going to get value out of it. But that post-emergent spray, absolutely crucial. About 6 weeks post sowing, depending on growth, could be a little bit earlier, could be a little bit later. So it can be anywhere kind of from probably about 4.5 weeks up to about 7 weeks is where you're going to optimize, where you're going to see the best response from your post-emergent spray. You want the dock leaf to be about the size of a €2 coin. If it gets any bigger than that, and you have clover in the sward, it gets a lot more challenging to kill the dock. Okay, because the clover safe sprays, they're probably not quite as effective, it's pretty fair to say, as the non-clover safe sprays. So timing is critical. Keep an eye, walk those fields, and make the right decision in terms of, watching the weather, getting the weeds at the right stage, and ensure you read the label in advance and adhere to the label advice in terms of getting the best return from applying that product.
Mary, one aspect that may be overlooked, you're after going through everything in reseed, and we could do everything right up to that point. Just in terms of the grazing management that reseeded sward in that first year, how important is it to get that right, and what impact can that have?
Oh yeah, Kieran, it's hugely important to get the grazing management right, because you leave it too long and you'll start to have shading and tiller death, so you lose plants out of the sward, and I suppose you go in and graze it too often, and the plant doesn't have the opportunity to build its energy reserves in the root, so you kind of tire out the plant and it won't persist as long. So, optimizing your grazing management post sowing. And look, I suppose I'd be a fan of optimising your grazing management all the time, but definitely post-sowing, getting that right is absolutely critical to give the sward the best chance to get well established, to tiller up, to taken out. And I suppose that's kind of going in at pre-grazing covers of, somewhere between, the first couple of grazings are probably going to be about 800 to 1,000, and then maybe up to, 1,000 to 1,200, depending on the system that you're you're using. So, kind of those frequent grazings, and bearing in mind, I suppose, with your new reseed, it is going to be a lot more responsive and it's going to grow a lot quicker than your older swards on the farm. So it's important to come around to that new reseed at the right time rather than just following your usual rotation in order to get the best return from it.
Finally, Mary, can you just give us some details in relation to the department's scheme?
Yeah, so the department scheme, Catherine, on both the multi-species and the red clover, which we discussed a little bit earlier on in this podcast. So that's essentially farmers who are interested in applying for that this year needs to apply for that through their BIS application. So that'll have to be done by the middle of May. And then they have up until the 15th of July to sow the seed. And what it means basically is for farmers looking to sow a red clover silage sward or a multi-species grazing mixture, they can get up to €300 per hectare or €120 per acre back from the department for sowing those swards. And essentially it's about looking at those swards which have the potential to fix nitrogen and reduce our fertiliser nitrogen. And that's why the department are getting in behind them. But, a lot of benefits from the farmer if they're considering sowing either of those type of mixtures to apply for that scheme and claim the money back from the department for the scheme. So, it's quite a significant contribution to the cost of reseeding this year.
Mary, thanks very much. That was a great update to get at this stage of season, and hopefully we'll see a bit of reseeding done now over the next couple of weeks.
Thanks very much, Mary.
No problem.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. Again, I'd like to thank Mary for coming on, offering some very useful advice. Hopefully, just will get an opportunity over the coming weeks to get some reseeding done. That's it for me for Updates on Our Sheep programme. Keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.